Good evening. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Unfiltered. My name is Ridi Klabi. Thank you for joining us on Unfiltered tonight. So, last week, I bet many of you were not watching the show because you were watching or attending a landmark concert that took place in South Africa. It certainly put South Africa on the global map. First, it featured the world's favorite queen, Beyonce, or Queen Bee, to her hive, and her significant other, Jay-Z. The creme de la creme of South Africa's entertainment industry was also represented, with Caster Nyovest stealing the show. They were all brought there by South African billionaire Patrice Motsepe. The aim, of course, was to land a lethal blow on poverty. The people tasked with ending poverty in our society, I'm talking about elected public officials, including President Cyril Ramaphosa and his ministers, were there mingling with global celebrities. But what is wrong with this picture? Did the fight against poverty gain momentum, or was this a platform for philanthrocapitalism? Later on, I'll be joined by Professor Patrick Bond, who's a professor of political economy at the Wits School of Governance, and of course, Rihanna Musaji, former MMC for Transport in the city of Johannesburg. She's a speaker, she's a facilitator, and calls herself the Barefoot Facilitator. But first, I do want to talk to Zweli Mbele, who's a radio presenter and social media commentator. He witnessed the chaotic aftermath of this concert and shared some harrowing experiences that I think many people experienced and observed. We'll get into that in a moment. But first, let's take a look at this.
Last week Sunday, South Africa hosted some of the world's best in the entertainment and media industry, influencers and some heads of state. This was courtesy of South Africa's first black billionaire, Patrice Motsepe, through the Motsepe Foundation.
This is, I mean, as you said, absolutely outstanding to honor the most special human being that walked the earth.
The major highlight was the hosting of the world-class glittering Global Citizen Music Festival in Soweto. Headlining the festival was none other than Beyonce and her famous world-renowned husband and rapper Jay-Z. Usher was there as well. Local superstar Caster Nyovest and local internationally renowned house DJ Maestro also performed at the event. The festival was a culmination of a series of philanthropic events by the South African billionaire Patrice Motsepe. Philanthropy is a major part of some of the world's billionaires. These include Bill Gates, who is reported to have donated more than $27 billion through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Warren Buffett is reported to have donated at least $21 billion. George Soros over $8 billion.
I'm a little bit ashamed of being a philanthropist now. So I actually understand that they can't see me the way I am.
And Africa's own Aliko Dangote is reported to have donated no less than $22 billion to charity work.
As leaders,
Motsepe joins a club of billionaires across the world that have committed themselves to contribute to sharing their wealth with needy charity causes. However, critics argue that philanthropy is mainly a self-serving exercise meant to increase the visibility of the donating companies and the promotion of both the companies and their owners. In the case of last Sunday, some have highlighted how the world of the business and political razzmatazz came in total conflict with the poverty world of Soweto.
And I think the much talked about aftermath of this concert really reflects the chasm between power and those who don't have power, because after the celebration, chaos ensued. Let's take a look at these visuals. Okay, so what we see there are revelers after the concert going to the Cecil garage, waiting for transport, Uber, their parents to pick them up. They were mugged, there were stabbings, attempted rapes, sexual harassment. But watch that circle. Look at what's happening there. Brazen attacks violence. And what stands out is that the police are absent. This is what happened after the concert. All those celebrities and our public officials that graced that stage were nowhere to be seen at that point. And if you read media reports in the aftermath of the concert, nobody has taken responsibility. You have the police acknowledging that they could have done more, but that it wasn't their job. You have the Metro Police saying it wasn't them. The concert organizers, it wasn't them. But what we do know is that somewhere in South Africa tonight, there are young men and women who were attacked last week. They have no recourse. Nobody has listened to them. There are young women who were nearly raped, and many were sexually harassed. But power and authority are not there to listen to them and take their plight seriously. So tonight's question is relevant if you consider the aftermath of that concert. And it is, in whose interest is the practice of philanthropy? Because if there was ever an occasion to show solidarity, to show that those who are putting money, fighting poverty, if there was ever an occasion to show that those people are in tune and in touch with the real world, that was it. They should have been there doing or saying something. But I bet you, as young people were screaming, at that moment, the famous and the powerful were safe in their hotel rooms. Zweli Mbele.
Yes.
I met Zweli on Twitter, on social media. You posted some harrowing accounts of what happened last week. And I remember one particular tweet where you said you saw a group of men trying to rape a woman.
Yeah.
And when running to the police, they were literally laughing at you. That's not what you expected when you went to F&B last week.
No, it definitely isn't. I think leaving the festival in general was a bit of an odd experience because we all expected to get our transport at certain points and there were signs directing us, but we saw those signs a little bit later on. So the first point I think everyone was a little bit confused was after the concert there were no security. So there wasn't anyone that you could necessarily ask as to, okay, where can we get our Uber or Taxify, whatever mode of transport you are using that evening. So I think everyone had the same thought. At the time, I was actually a little bit annoyed with my friends because I was like, why are we going to the Sasol? Let's just wait it out here. But eventually we went because we thought that that's a landmark. It's easier just to, I guess,
Absolutely.
But once we got to the Sasol, it was wild.
What happened? I mean, I saw the footage, but in your own words, what happened?
Yeah, the first thing that I noticed was that I'm pretty sure there were more than 1,000 of us, young people at the Sasol, everyone waiting for their transport. So we thought that was a safe space. And we decided to go wait in the light because we're thinking that there's petrol attendants and there should be some sort of security or police over there. But there weren't any. And at any given moment, people were just running. We weren't sure why they were running, where they were running to. But I guess when you're shocked, you also just start running immediately. So we thought, let's go walk in between the cars, just in the road outside the Sasol, because you're within traffic, so no one's going to attack you when you're there. And that's when we just heard, first you heard whistles, and after a few guys started whistling, you just see 5, 6, sometimes 7 of them at a time, just attacking people. And that's when I noticed, when we're trying to turn back to now, go back to the Sasol, even though we didn't feel safe, we felt it was safer because there's light. That's when I saw a group of guys go to a couple. They ran to the young lady and they picked her up and they were ripping her clothes off. And her boyfriend was there helpless. I didn't know what to do because I am now with my little sister. I'm with friends who are female as well. So your first point of thought is, you want to go help, but if I go there and I leave my little sister standing alone, what's going to happen to her? Because they were attacking in groups and just multiple groups at a time. So while that was going on, I had friends who also witnessed a bunch of guys open a young lady's door of her car, and they were trying to pulling her out, and I think the screams, that's still what sits with me to now.
And you did tweet later that young woman who was attacked was eventually saved because a group of guys went there and kind of fought off the attackers.
Yeah.
But there's one thing that you also said, that at the back of your mind, you were thinking, what am I going to say to my parents if something happens to my little sister? Yeah. And I think that's what really resonated with me. It was traumatic.
Yeah.
I felt so much compassion and solidarity for you. But the fact of the matter is that it doesn't undo the experience that a young man like yourself, you were there to just have fun, and you were thinking, what do I say to mum and dad if something happens to my little sister?
Yeah, there was a moment that evening when I honestly thought that, okay, this is probably the day that I'm going to die, because people were screaming and saying that they've got guns. We had seen some people who had been stabbed as well. There was a lady who was trying to seek help with her, I think it was her husband, and he was just pleading with anyone who would listen, saying, I just need help because my wife has just been stabbed. And what do you do in that situation? Yeah.
So this is 7 days ago. Police have reacted. The police minister has said stuff. Don't ask me what he said, but it didn't quite address what you all were raising. How do you feel about how South Africa has reacted to what happened last week?
In terms of the authorities, I feel let down. I feel that crime is something that's not taken seriously at all. Because you hear these stories, and we've got, I think everyone can relate, we've got friends and family who have been involved in hijackings and house robberies. But I think once you experience it yourself, that's when, and especially when you don't get a response from the people that you think will, you know, at least admit to it and say that we actually did let you down in this instance, because to stand at a garage where people are being mugged, there's people that are being sexually assaulted, they're being stabbed. I mean, everyone's lives were threatened at that point, and you don't even have one police van. Just one. I think the first police van we saw was after about 2:30 in the morning, around that time. And
the concert finished like 3 hours before that.
Exactly.
What were your hopes when you went to the concert? You weren't trying to fight poverty, were you?
No, I think
you just want to see Queen Bee. Let's be honest, no judgment. Tell me the truth.
Look, I like a good time. I like having fun.
Good for you.
That goes without saying.
Yeah.
But I think in the week running up to that, because I've got a radio show, we were giving away tickets. And the manner in which ran the competition was we wanted to see what goodwill you're doing. And leading up to that, you know, I was personally inspired. I remember chatting to my co-presenter, and I was saying that, you know, there's something that I want to start as well, because I think even though you weren't directly involved in the beginning and you thought that I just wanted tickets because I'm going to get to see Beyonce and Jay-Z and the best in the world, I think just seeing how much people are actually contributing, I think it did spark something in quite a lot of people, including myself. But that was all forgotten after 11 p.m. that evening. Even
Hold
the concert.
Hold that thought. We're going to expand a little bit more on that after the break. Stay with us.
Hey, Baba. You've been partying the whole night.
You complain a lot, man. If it's not the leaves, then it's the noise.
I've asked you so nicely before. Now I'm calling my lawyer.
Ooh, I am so scared. And like, where's your lawyer?
My lawyer is right here. Clientele leaders.
Problems with the neighbors, rental disputes, advice on maintenance matters, drawing up a will. Clientele Legal will speak up for you. SMS DEFEND to 32281. We'll call you back.
We at Network explore all things technological.
The modern battlefield is the battlefield of the mind, and the tools for affecting the mind are social media.
We look at how technology advances medicine and education.
Children can learn up to 60% more information in a shorter condensed amount of time using virtual reality as a medium for instruction.
From music, gaming, even computer-generated supermodels. Be a part of our network Saturdays at 8:30 p.m. and Sundays at 5:30 p.m.
We are at the forefront of Africa's tech discussion.
We're already planning for the 5G spectrum to be licensed by 2020.
In Mauritius, for fiber migration, we had a strategy. On Network, we have gadgets, robots, and more.
We focus on investing in entrepreneurs and technology in emerging markets.
There's technology and social media news on Network with me, Spumelele Zondi, every Saturday at 8:30 p.m. and every Sunday at 5:30 p.m.
Welcome back. You are watching Unfiltered. My guest tonight, Zweli Mbele. He's a radio presenter and social media commentator. Professor Patrick Bond, Professor of Political Economy at the Wits School of Governance. We also have Rihanna Musaji, former MMC for Transport in the city of Johannesburg. But I'm more interested in what she's doing now. She's a facilitator. She's a speaker. She speaks about diversity and she calls herself the Barefoot Facilitator. We'll hear more about her work in just a moment. But you too can be a part of this conversation on Facebook and Twitter using hashtag SABC News Unfiltered. Now, tonight on Unfiltered, we ask in whose interest is the practice of philanthropy. We've just been reflecting on the Global Citizen Concert. We talked about the stars who were there, political power, authorities that were represented, but then the aftermath, we all know about it. Not a single person has taken responsibility for the chaos that ensued afterwards. And Zweli has just spent the last part of the show just telling us what was happening. Rihanna, you are very passionate about public spaces, making them equitable, accessible, responsive to the needs of the youth and the poor. Your reflection of what went on that day and how you define this problem.
So really, I think what happened last Sunday is really a reflection of the fact that public spaces are not safe spaces for all, not at a concert, not on a normal day. And public spaces are our biggest shared spaces. Our road spaces are our biggest shared spaces. And in fact, those who have privilege have more rights in many of those spaces than others. I think if you look at our cities and young people, our cities really discriminate against the ability of young people to be out, have a good time, as young people often want to do, and do that safely. And I think as a parent, I mean, listening to Zweli talk, having young children of my own, young adult kids, knowing just the horror every time they're out and until they're back home, the kind of anxiety, I'm really, really concerned that we're a society that's living with unacceptable levels of anxiety around basic safety in public space.
What is power not getting? What are those people who were at the concert, who organized it, who were hanging around with the politicians and the celebrities, what are they not getting about the state of our society?
Well, I think really the issue is when you are whisked off in your fancy vehicle, probably with a driver and a bodyguard, and you have VIP access into the stadium. Maybe you didn't even leave the stadium when all this was happening, because I mean, I've been in those VIP boxes. I know what happens in those VIP boxes. You're taken really good care of. You get home safely. I think there's a massive disconnect between those in power, as I've started to call them, the blue light brigade people, and the rest of us. They really have no sense of what many of us go through on a daily basis. And I mean, I think the responses to what happened, I think the fact that it happened was bad enough, but the responses, the lack of care, the lack of humanity in how people have responded to this is even more shocking.
So, Patrick, it's so easy to blame the wealthy people, to say they just don't get it. But at the same time, you kind of want to cut them some slack. They're spending their money, bringing powerful people to South Africa, making a dent on poverty. But Rihanna used a very interesting word, disconnect. When you reflect on philanthropy and what it aims to do, does it have its finger on the pulse? What are your thoughts?
Well, thanks for having me, Riddy. Yeah, it's a very difficult time because you've got the metaphor exactly right, the disconnect between power that postures fighting poverty and then the rest of us. And I think the main dilemma for philanthrocapitalism, as it's technically become known as, is the acquisition of cultural capital by those who give money. So they really clean their name, often after having earned their money. Let's say Bill Gates, until recently the richest man in the world, through monopolization tendencies with his Microsoft company. George Soros, who himself has admitted, as you saw in the segment, to not being comfortable being a philanthropist whose money comes from financial speculation, a sort of rentier, parasitical activity. He's open about that. This is the sort of question then for philanthropists. Are they doing anti-poverty work as some sort of scam. And we could, I think, legitimately ask that question after last Sunday, partly because the key anti-poverty figure was the World Bank president, Jim Yong Kim. Jim Kim runs an institution that has a 20% ownership in the CPS Net 1, which took 17 million of our people who get the grants and took away through stop orders, big chunks of those for cell phone and microfinance. He has a big chunk of the Medupi power plant, the biggest loan they ever made, including with awareness that there was corruption there. And the bank was also involved in the Lonmin incident just before Maracana and gave Lonmin the corporate social responsibility sort of poster child award for good behavior. That this is an institution that's completely out of touch, and I was disappointed that Patrice Motsepe would bring the World Bank as some sort of a model. I think in a way the technical fixes, the neoliberalism, the market-oriented strategies with philanthrocapitalism is a model of why South Africa is the way it is, right? The most unequal city in the world, this one, the most unequal country in the world. We're in big trouble, and this was just one symptom of it last week.
And it seems like then there's a cognitive dissonance between what the torchbearers of philanthropy avow and claim publicly and their business practices. We ought to worry about the organizations and what they stand for, and not just look at the money that they pledge to fighting poverty.
Really, that's right. If they were serious, I think they would fight poverty by helping the organizations that have shown again and again. This weekend is the 20th anniversary of Treatment Action Campaign, and if there's any institution in Africa that has defeated poverty at the micro level of the body, of the HIV-positive body, getting those medicines that used to cost $10,000 a year, and now they're free for more than 5 million people. You know, our life expectancy was 52 about 15 years ago. Today it's 64. That's the anti-poverty event. You saw TAC had a vigil last night, and none of the attention that these other guys are getting for their fun and games.
But come on, Patrick, are you being hard on these guys? Are you a bit of a cynic about donations and philanthropy? I mean, I look at these figures, US 27 billion rand, US dollars given by Bill Gates, Warren Buffett saying that the wealthiest people must give up half of their wealth, and it sounds so absolutely amazing. George Soros, over 8 billion US dollars. They're giving some of that money away, right? So what's the problem?
Right, with a few exceptions. Sometimes Soros is promoting some structural change through his Open Society Foundation. I'll admit that, and I've received grants when I ran a centre at UKZN from Open Society. But generally, the rich want to keep the structure of society the same. Do you remember Zwelinzima Vavi's metaphor? It was of an Irish coffee, which is this black massive drink, and then a nice white cream, and then you sprinkle a few bits of cinnamon or cocoa on top. That's the structure of society. It's a toxic brew because after 1994, we could have had a freedom charter, a reconstruction and development program. Instead, we got neoliberalism, the market, plus the black economic empowerment, which is basically assimilating just a handful of people like Patrice Motsepe, Cyril Ramaphosa, right into this terrible mess, and this is the extent to which they fail to solve the problems. All of the indicators of poverty, unemployment, inequality have gone through the roof since 1994.
I want to get a response from you to my next question, but Rihanna, I'll bring you in there, because what I observed last week was that you had the celebrities, of course, the people who have a great following on social media, and they've made their mark, they're using their talent and all of that. And then you had business. You had the king, or Zwelithini, Goodwill Zwelithini, and then you had political power. But what was missing was the civil society voice. So for me, that reflected the distance between the people who are on the ground, who can advise, who know where the problems are and how to intervene in those problems, and the people who have the authority, but they're not quite listening. That's what I saw.
So really, I mean, I think it's very easy, even for civil society actors, to get caught up in the glitz and glamour that is shown as kind of, this is when you've arrived, when you're able to do things this way. And I think we really are pushing a very consumerist vision of life, an I, me vision. I've got to have the latest stuff, the latest tech, the best car, the best house, and then I would have arrived. And I think it's being pushed, this level of consumerism is being pushed across society. So certainly, as Patrick says, I mean, the structural issues around poverty, but all of this, let's not forget, has happened in the 16 days of activism. We've just heard Zweli talk about, and I mean, how many events have there been? How many pledges? And here was a real opportunity for somebody to say, if people knew that this was happening, if they didn't know in the moment, I think the retrospective response is even more concerning. The retrospective response that says, well, social media has blown this out of proportion. Well, if it was even one isolated incident, if it was just Zweli and what he experienced, that was one too many. But I think also this is symptomatic, really, and I think that's the issue. The reason why this one has received attention is because it was Global Citizen Fest, and then suddenly these images were across the world, and people were now embarrassed that overall the concert went off well, and why are these few spoilers who went through whatever bringing this negative attention? But I think the reality is you had the power of social media at work here. You had the power of opinion makers who were able to shift the discussion. When this happens on a daily basis to people who don't have access to power, who don't have access to voice, who turn up at a police station and get no compassion for what they've been through, then what are we fixing, actually?
In fact, I mean, none of this is hypothetical. It's reality. I heard somebody on the radio last week phoning in and saying, I hear and I sympathize, but this happens to us every single time we go to the stadium, every single time we go to watch a football match, but we don't get the coverage because there were no global stars. But really, before we let you go in this particular segment, do you think that your life has changed as a result of what happened last week? I mean, when you reflect on it, the trauma is certainly there. Yeah. But what do you think about your place in this big world as a young person?
I think it, more than anything for myself, and I think everyone who was involved, it just shows you that you're just a little ant. Like, everything that I saw that day, like everyone's just been highlighting, that happens to people every single day of their lives. A woman walking across the street. Because if these guys are so brazen that they could try and sexually assault someone in full view of so many people over there, what's going to stop them when a young lady's walking across the road at any point?
What do you want to say to the authorities, whether they are, you know, they've got economic power or political power? We saw the police talking, the police minister just responding. How can they make this right?
Firstly, acknowledge what has happened. Because when I think it was a statement that I saw on Monday that we're all doing this for social media popularity. That really hurt because it's a real life experience that so many of us had been through. So I think acknowledging that this is what has happened and that they've heard us, they've seen, I guess, the footage as well that's out on social media, that definitely would help a little bit. But I think showing us as well that they're helping, I guess, the general public out there, people who are going through this every single day. Because I go home, I get into my complex, it's guarded, there's security over there. When I open my door...
But real life happens.
Yeah, everything is fine.
How's your sister?
She's trying to stay strong at the moment, but my employer, they have organized counseling sessions for the both of us, and I encouraged her as well to come through with me because I think that she's just trying to mask everything that has happened and try to focus on the fact that the festival was wonderful inside. But I think it's something that is going to come up again.
Thank you for talking to us and good luck.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so very much. We'll continue our conversation with Rihanna and Professor Patrick Bond, just really talking about philanthropy. Who does it serve? And what do we need to do to create real access? And what do we need to do to really make a dent on poverty? And I'm talking about the structural changes that are needed. Stay with us.
The Great Bank Heist.
Well, it was brazen. It was quick.
One thought we're perhaps looking at figures much, much lower. Right. It's almost 2 billion.
It was shared amongst very greedy VBS executives and politically connected individuals. You are listed in that report. Did you steal money?
The narrative that they're trying to create is proven wrong by Advocate Mtao's report himself. He said in point 59 that he could not find a definitive a wrongdoing, anything factually.
The misleading information which Daily Maverick has is deliberate. It's part of the whole propaganda machinery. You can challenge this poly fanfare to bring us the so-called evidence that I received 10 million. It's pure insanity.
Is there any prospect whatsoever of saving VBS?
We are not as confident as we were when we started the curatorship as to restoring the bank.
The bank is in a hopeless situation and it cannot be saved.
So TB continues to be the top infectious killer worldwide, claiming 4,500 lives a day. It is estimated that approximately 1% of the global population is autistic. So if you're on a medical aid, how well do you understand the benefit structure and how your medical aid generally works? And if you're not on a medical aid, have you considered belonging to one? So how much and what should you know about this condition? Is it curable? Can people living with epilepsy, for instance, play sport, drive cars, get employed? 7 million people around the world die annually as a result of tobacco use.
For Health Tip, catch Health Talk every Saturday from 9 to 10.
Welcome back. You are watching Unfiltered tonight. We're reflecting on philanthropy. Sounds all good, but what are the other layers? My guest, Professor Patrick Bond, Professor of Political Economy at the Wits School of Governance. I also have Rihanna Musaji, former MMC for Transport in the city of Johannesburg. She's a motivator, she's a speaker, she's a facilitator, calls herself the Barefoot Facilitator. You can be a part of this conversation on Facebook and Twitter using hashtag SABC News Unfiltered. And tonight on Unfiltered, we are asking in whose interest is the practice of philanthropy. So, Patrick, I want to talk to you about temporary relief. Is there space, though, for philanthropy, or are we talking about the structural matters, which are very important? But when life happens, like in Alexander, we had the shack fires, 500 shacks, homes, let me call them people's homes, destroyed. Who must rise up at that moment? Is there space for philanthropy in our world today? And how should philanthropy intervene in those spaces?
Well, absolutely. If there's emergency responses, and I mean, we have probably the best in the world, the gift of the givers that goes everywhere and just, solves logistical problems where states are too incompetent or unwilling, or there's bad politics. I mean, we have some great examples. But it's the old question, isn't it? Is the reform or is the Band-Aid that's being put on actually a distraction from the structural solution? And so usually there's a fork in the road. And if you remember in the early 80s, this is before your time, but the United Democratic Front had a choice. Should they go with the apartheid reforms that P.W. Botha had put on, which were to put a colored and Indian House of Delegates, House of Reps, or should they fight for one person, one vote? And there were black local authorities and homelands. Those, let me call them reformist reforms, those actually strengthened P.W. Botha. And so they were rejected by the UDF. They wanted a non-reformist or a transformative reform. Usually philanthropists won't fund that stuff. They won't go where there's anything that could be radically upsetting. And in this country, one person, one vote in a unitary state would not have got any philanthropists locally on board. I mean, they might claim they're Democrats, they were anti-apartheid like Johan Rupert did, but no, they wouldn't do anything to get a genuine democracy. And I think that's going to be the litmus test for anyone who's serious about, say, fighting poverty. Are they really going to the root of the problem or just doing some soup kitchen ladling?
And in order to do that, in order to make a dent on the structural issues, they'd have to go against political power. I mean, look at the concert as a case study, the proximity of politics and business. Anywhere in the world, and I'm not singling out Patrice Motsepe, the wealthy have to work with the political authority there. So you can't really talk about the structural issues without upsetting the politicians.
Well, that would be why you'd want to fund the progressive groups at the grassroots or in the shop floors, women's groups who really are fighting patriarchy or racism or capitalism or the ecological destruction. In this case, Patrice Motsepe, his two brothers-in-law are Cyril Ramaphosa and Jeff Kadebe. Motsepe has a piece of coal export in Richards Bay. Jeff Kadebe is pushing us to do more coal. I mean, this is a really ridiculous set of crony capitalists, conflicts of interest throughout our governance system. It's as bad as, I think, the US. It's in a way worse there because you have right-wing philanthropists. You've heard of the Koch brothers.
Yes.
And maybe Robert Mercer. Mercer was Donald Trump's main backer. And they can not only put their men in power, in this case Trump was absolutely put there by these philanthro-capitalists, the Koch brothers and Mercer, but they also have a social engineering agenda. And if you look at carefully at what their sort of 2-3 decade-long agenda is, it's to take every aspect of the society, starting actually with universities. That's what we have to do a lot better as academics, is understand where the power is. And unfortunately, our neoliberal universities seek money. That's why Jim Kim actually, I think, has such an easy time going around to places like WITS and giving talks without facing tough questions about Marikana, about Medupi, about the SASA grants that his institution took so much out of from poor people's pockets.
And Joanna, just going back to the Alexander example, I mean, immediately after I asked the question, I felt the discomfort that the question was, when there's an emergency and there are shacks that burnt down and people need immediate help, surely philanthropy has a role there. But as soon as I asked the question, I thought, in a just world, nobody would be living in a shack. In a just world, an emergency would not necessarily involve a poor person losing his or her home, a poor person in those kind of debilitating, dehumanizing conditions, because that's what we need to address, really.
So really, I think philanthropy has a role. Whether it actually steps in at the kinds of times you're talking about, I'm not always sure, because often there are lots of rules around kind of philanthropic foundations and how they dispense money and so forth. I mean, I think all of that is good, but what we're not really confronting is that we're becoming more and more unequal as a society. And that should concern everyone, from business to politicians to civil society organizations. That I think we're seeing increasingly all the symptoms of an unequal society. And no matter how much you try to securitize, that's not a response to an increasingly unjust world. And of course, with the impacts of climate change, the poor are likely to suffer even more, and disproportionately so, for lifestyle choices that others are making. And I think it really does require of us to then say, can we continue with the lifestyle choices we're making? Can we continue with the amassing of wealth when there's the kinds of poverty that we're seeing around us? And, you know, is the kind of publicizing the CEO sleep-outs and et cetera, are those really getting us the requisite changes that we need?
In fact, that was my next question, Patrick, the PR that comes with it. I mean, it's kind of obscene, isn't it? Are the cameras just there watching you give this money, or this is something that is engineered? You know, it's all cosmetic, it's all put together. There's a PR element of it that is almost nauseating.
Well, and they hire the best in the world to do this sort of PR, or let's call it a sort of new philosophy of social engineering. And I do follow the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I think they deserve particular mention because they've used the toilet. And of course, who can object to expanding sanitation? But you look at actually what they've done in Durban, which is one of their key pilots, and it's to reintroduce the bucket system for about 90,000 households, anywhere outside of their so-called...
But they've got a nice presentation about why this makes sense and why it is...
And yet, in a place like Durban, to try to separate the urine and the solids, which is the whole strategy, without giving people water to flush, because that's the neoliberal agenda, not subsidizing sufficiently. In a place like Durban that's very humid this time of the year, and also that so many HIV-positive people who have diarrhea, you can't make that separation in the urine diversion toilet. It just failed miserably. If you do polls, which they've done, 95% of the people say, actually, we don't want this. We'd actually like to go back to the flush. His agenda, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation agenda for toilets, is to find something that will give something to poor people. But it, again, is a distraction from providing the proper sanitation system. We said we're getting rid of the bucket system, and yet there it is in Durban. That's the majority of what they've supplied.
What should we do with all of this? What should the public know? What should we demand of our leaders? Last words, Rihanna, quickly.
So I think it's really about insisting that our elected representatives in particular come back to the constituencies that have given them the opportunity to be there and live life in the same way that people do on a daily basis.
Patrick?
And I'd say that the state should tax these guys and use that funding in a proper way with a democratic input. And that's a dilemma. Since the 80s, most of the policies have been so pro-rich that we've got this sort of gilded age, as it's called, where the ultra-rich, the top 1%, have gotten all the resources, and the old social democratic visions, or the Reconstruction Development Program, is underfunded, and we expect some philanthropists to come in and band-aid up the problems. It's not working.
Patrick Bond, thank you so very much for sharing your insights, Professor Patrick Bond, and of course, always a pleasure speaking to you, Rihanna Musaji. Thanks indeed. So let's say goodbye to my guests, but our show does continue. When we come back, we're going to talk about this place, the SABC, the turbulence. What on earth is going on here? And have we not been here before? Why do we not get it right? Stay with us.
Buildings, submerged homes and devastated families.
Biggest earthquake in here.
Their homes and buildings moved like boats.
Big shake, and I ran as fast as I can.
These are the satellite images depicting the area before the disaster.
The ground is like a wave.
I've never seen anything like this in my life.
It is unbelievable. You can actually smell the stench of dead bodies around.
The National Hurricane Center said earlier on Tuesday that Michael was a Category 1 storm with sustained winds of up to 150 kilometers per hour. Residents were implored to get out of harm's way ahead of life-threatening waves, winds and rains. Flash flooding over the weekend caused 13 deaths in Central America after Michael formed off the coast of northern Honduras.
We are at the forefront of Africa's tech discussion.
We're already planning for the 5G spectrum to be licensed by 2020.
In Mauritius, for fiber migration, we had a strategy. On network, we have gadgets, robots, and more.
We focus on investing in entrepreneurs and technology in emerging markets.
There's technology and social media news on Network with me, Spumelele Zondi, every Saturday at 8:30 p.m. and every Sunday at 5:30 p.m.
So welcome back. This is the second part of the show, Unfiltered. We are talking now about the instability at the SABC. The technically insolvent public broadcaster is facing resistance to plans to retrench at least 2,000 workers to cut escalating costs and obviously stay afloat. Following periods of wasteful expenditure and ineffective boards, it owes service providers hundreds of millions of rands, firstly. Amid all of this, we know that 4 of the SABC board members have resigned, and because of these resignations, the board may not form a quorum. But I must just say that there were denials, no confirmations, and this one doesn't know that this one has resigned, and so on. The board, we know, cannot make any decisions. So my guests tonight are Pippa Green, who's a former SABC board member and former head of SABC Radio News, and now she works with UCT as a researcher for the research project on employment, income distribution and inclusive growth. And she is joining us from our Sea Point studios in the Western Cape. And of course, here in Johannesburg, we've got Duduetsang Makuse, who's with the SOS Coalition, Support Public Broadcasting, and she's the national coordinator. And remember that you too can be a part of this conversation on Facebook and Twitter using the hashtag SABC News Unfiltered. And Duduetsang, I'm going to start with you. There was a period of optimism, let me call it that, when we had the interim board and it seemed as if bad management was being dealt with at the SABC, and yet here we are yet again. Did you see it coming?
We did.
You did?
We did.
Why? Tell me.
We saw this coming soon after the permanent board was put in place, and they were already 4 members short coming in.
Okay.
That was remember, Nomvuiso Pachi didn't take her position, and then obviously in the coming months we had, I think, 3 resignations, Ms. Kalidas, Ms. Potgieter, and someone else. So we already knew that Parliament needed to get on with the business of filling those 4 vacancies, which we then started putting pressure on them to do. Around July, they advertised for those vacancies to be filled, and then dragged their feet after August, when they needed to shortlist and do the interviews. For some reason or other, there would always be a postponement of that process. So we saw this coming, and we knew that there would be some attempt to destabilize the board and create basically an incoherent board.
Do you think there's a deliberate attempt to destabilize the board?
I think most of the SABC's crises have been manufactured in one way or another. There's always a political entity or a political pressure or motivation of one sort or the other that creates some stability somewhere.
But what would be the reason now? I mean, don't we have a Tumamina, Send Me, A New Dawn and all of that? What is at stake here? What is the contestation about?
Tumaminas are also in a vacuum. You know, there's a Tumamina agenda, but it doesn't resolve the fact that it's coming in where people have been used to a certain type of status quo. So Tumamina can be pushing a culture of cleaning up and sweeping up and changing things, but it doesn't mean that everybody's on board. And I think that's part of why we saw this happen in this particular moment.
I think the election's also an issue here.
They've
we'll talk
got a
about
lot
that
to
in a
do
moment.
with that.
But Pippa, you know, I just can't help but take advantage of your presence tonight. You've sat on the board, you've been an executive here at the SABC, and year in and year out, the SABC seems to just be falling apart. But when I was working here many years ago, you were then head of radio news, there seemed to be a period of relative stability. Take us back to those years. What was working and what wasn't? And how do we explain the moment where we are today?
Well, it's so difficult, really, because I think things are worse. They look worse today in a whole lot of structural ways than they did then. But certainly whenever it was 17 years ago or 16 years ago when I was there and you were there was a kind of another new dawn when Peter Matlare was CEO, and there was a very good board headed by Vincent Mapai. And again, just around the time of the 2004 elections, the board was changed. There were new kind of news executives brought in who applied censorship of a sort that I think we both objected to, and which became known as the blacklisting saga. So there has been a problem that has recurred. But one other thing that I think is important to say is that the funding model of the SABC is a continuous challenge to whatever board comes in, because contrary to a lot of the sort of the stuff that's perpetrated on social media, the SABC does not get very much money from government. It doesn't get money from taxpayers. It relies on advertising revenues for most of its revenue, and that's one of the problems that I think the SABC faces.
And then on the political front, I mean, there's contestation for public spaces to control public perception. We're going into an election year. There's a lot at stake. So it is not inconceivable for politicians to have an unhealthy interest in the workings of the SABC. When you were there as an executive and also as a board member, did you encounter any of that? And how much of it do you think is at play at this moment?
It's very hard to see how much is at play, but there is an issue of a minister perhaps not agreeing with the board about the numbers that are available to everyone about the current financial crisis that the SABC is in, and a decision that the board has taken. It strikes me, it's worrying to me that of the 4 people who've resigned, 2 are very well-respected journalists with a long record of integrity and even, a track record of being in the news executive at SABC. That, I think, is very worrying and needs to be interrogated. So the political pressures might be there because we've got an election coming up next year, But I think that the key thing is financial, and that the government doesn't want to have, nearly 1,000 people or whatever it is. The retrenchment numbers add up to being retrenched at a time when an election is coming up. It is quite a lot of people, but I don't know. I haven't drilled down into the numbers sufficiently as the board should have to know what the options are.
And Dudueza, I want to bring you in there that when the board has satisfied itself that as part of the turnaround strategy, retrenchments have to happen, what is the ideal way of managing that that decision and that transition, given that government is a stakeholder, and we know that Faith Mutambi had to be told by the courts to stay out of it. But if the government is the custodian, as it were, of the people, with so many retrenchments, with so many lives at stake, is the minister or the government justified in wanting to have a say in this major decision? We'll talk about that in just a moment. Stay with us.
SABC is independent and impartial, and it's important that as we deliver the news, we do so without fear, without favour, without prejudice, and that we ensure that we get the multiplicity of views so that our stories and coverage is balanced.
We pride ourselves on being impartial as well as independent. On the agenda, we basically break down the stories of the day, give it more substance and give it more detail. So all in all, we basically take the news agenda of the day forward.
But more than that, we'll be able to reflect the stories of ordinary folk, people who are trying to make ends meet, facing the most incredibly difficult obstacles and circumstances, and that they will find that their realities are expressed on the SABC.
To be a part of something like this makes me proud, and I think that to be able to report the news in a fair, just, independent and impartial way is what the public broadcaster stands for.
Buildings, submerged homes and devastated families.
Biggest earthquake in here.
Their homes and buildings moved like boats.
Big shake, and I ran as fast as I can.
These are the satellite images depicting the area before the disaster.
The ground is like a wave.
I've never seen anything like this in my life.
It is unbelievable. You can actually smell the stench of dead bodies around.
The National Hurricane Center said earlier on Tuesday that Michael was a Category 1 storm with sustained winds of up to 150 kilometers per hour. Residents were implored to get out of harm's way ahead of life-threatening waves, winds and rains. Flash flooding over the weekend caused 13 deaths in Central America after Michael formed off the coast of northern Honduras.
Welcome back. We are now in the final segment of Unfiltered, and we're talking about the public broadcaster, your public broadcaster. There have been reports that the minister was trying to halt the retrenchments that were announced by the board, that there was some sort of conflict between the minister and the board. We know that 4 board members have resigned, thereby creating instability in the board and thereby and therefore in the organization. So what is happening here? What do we need to know about it? And I think what I've noted as well is the information blackout. I must tell our viewers that that's what has happened. We've invited the minister and we're told that she has a prior engagement, and then we also invited the board to be represented here this evening. Not a single person was available, and I think it is important for me to talk about this, because what it means is that the information blackout, you are not being told what is going on. You, the viewer, are not being informed by the public broadcaster as to what is happening. You have a stake in the SABC precisely because it is a public broadcaster. It is first disappointing that the executive is not available, but for me, more disappointing that the board that first announced these retrenchments is nowhere to be seen at a time like this. It is profoundly disappointing. Okay, so let's talk about this. Retrenchments are announced by the board. They were very confident. They were all over the SABC space and other media, justifying it, giving us the rationale. It sounded all reasonable. And then something happened in the last 2 weeks. They've all kind of disappeared. Are these retrenchments justified from your knowledge, firstly? And who should have the final say, the minister or the board?
So the minister can't really have a final say, just purely because retrenchments are an operational issue and should be left to the executive and the board. Nevertheless, because it is a public broadcaster, that's why we have Parliament, and that's why we have that committee that is made up of public representatives to come in and do the oversight over the board to make sure that if the board is indeed going to do something that is not in the public interest, that they as public officials are there to say, no, hang on a second, you need to change
So hold on, what are you saying? It should have been Parliament that intervened,
Parliament and the committee. Basically, the parliamentary committee are the ones that are supposed to come and say, right, board, this is what we think you need to do with regards to retrenchments. And I think that's what they've done over the past couple of months, which is why we're at this stalemate. There's been this back and forth between them where Parliament has said, we can't allow you to go through with this without us seeing an independent audit of who is going to be affected and why. And remember, the board is saying, but you gave us the mandate in your ad hoc report when you said there were improper salary increases, appointments, and all kinds of things that led to this big date. So the board is feeling justified in their decision, and they've tried all these other things. They've saved up to 430 million, doesn't really come to near to saving the SABC. Also, you don't have other revenue sources coming in. So now they're sitting there thinking, well, this is the last resort. We've done everything else. And Parliament is saying, no, we still want you to do this piece of homework before you go through with that. Minister is allowed to be concerned, but even in her concern, she has to go through Parliament. Otherwise, she starts encroaching on the operational space of the executive and the board.
Pippa, I mean, your comments about the SABC and why it's important. I mean, there have been so many moments where I thought it should just shut down. We should all give up on it. But we actually can't, because ordinary South Africans rely on the SABC for information, to be kept informed, and it is a powerful, powerful platform if used correctly. Your thoughts?
No, completely ready, and I think that we need to recapture that vision that we had in the post-apartheid days. I mean, you remember that the interviews for the first board at the time of CODESA negotiations were a huge public event because civil society was so determined that the broadcaster should be not a state one, but a public one. And what developed out of that was a vision that I think was exercised on both the TV and radio platforms. I mean, radio in particular is the biggest purveyor of news in the country. The top 10 of the top 10 radio stations, 8 are SABC radio stations. I think Ukhozi, Mhlobo Weneni and Lesedi are the top 3. And the other thing that the SABC can do and has done in the past is to really provide a means of better social cohesion in the country. So those living in the city can find out what's going on in rural areas, Limpopo and Mpumalanga, etc. Because the SABC is the only news organization that has got offices there. So really, in a sense, one has to put forward a vision and then look at the structure to implement that vision, and then to figure out, with the retrenchments, I think that one needs a skills audit to say what is important. Are managers important, or are reporters important? Are advertising people important to raise revenue, or are administrators important? It's those kind of questions, and I'm not sure whether we have that information. It's disappointing to me that you say that you asked the minister and the board and that they have declined this opportunity, because perhaps those are the kind of questions that that they would be able to answer.
Maybe they've taken early Christmas, who knows? And then, of course, there's that SIU investigation report. We need to get that comment very, very quickly. It's relevant to the whole conversation. Where does that fit in?
I think the SIU issue is around whether or not the security tender was lawfully,
by the board.
By the board, by the interim board at the time. So obviously that conflates the issues. But I mean, I think key to the whole discussion is really the fact that there's no commitment from government to recapitalize the SABC. All these discussions would really be smoothed out and would go much faster if we got commitment for some kind of guarantee to make sure that we can go past March 2019.
And the elections, where do you think they fit into the last 2 weeks' shenanigans? Come on.
I think they're central to all of it.
In what way? Somebody's trying to influence the SABC? Somebody?
They might be trying to influence the SABC, but the problem is it's a very short-sighted strategy if in case that's what happened.
It's happened before.
But in this instance, it's very short-sighted because there will not be nothing left except the building to recapture. Nothing. There'll be no people here to pay salaries at all. Never mind 2,000. Everyone will be in trouble. So let's recapitalize it and let's go back to the drawing table and have a discussion about how to move forward.
Pippa Green, much obliged. Thank you very much for your time this evening. Thanks indeed. And Dudu Etsang, thank you very much. That's the last show for the year. We'll see you back here again on the 13th of January. Drive safely, don't drink and drive, and reconnect with your loved ones. We'll see you again in 2019. Goodbye.
To be a part of something like this makes me proud. And I think that to be able to report the news in a fair, just, independent and impartial way is what the public broadcaster stands for.